Idaho legislature barely got it together enough to pass a budget this session, but they seem to have all the time in the world to propose bill after bill that the Democrats labeled as discriminatory against trans Idahoans. Today on CityCast Boise, Mia Maldonado, reporter with the Idaho Capital Sun, is here to help us sort through what these new laws say and break down what they ultimately will mean for Idahoans. It's Wednesday, April 17th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Mia, thank you so much for joining us today. You did so much incredible work over the session. I'm so glad we get to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So there were over 600 bills this legislative session, and that's quite a bit more than normal. And there was a lot of focus on bills that will primarily affect transgender, intersex, and non-binary Idahoans. So I really wanted to talk with you about those. You wrote lots of really interesting articles about those and really broke them down. So I want to see if we can talk about those bills and the impact that they're going to have, because so many of them got signed into law.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with House Bill 421. When reporting on this bill, you called it the Gender Definition Bill, and it was introduced by Representative Julianne Young and Representative Bruce Skog. And Representative Young said that she had some help with this bill from the Heritage Foundation and the Alliance Defending Freedom. Could you maybe give us a breakdown on what this bill was and kind of what it means?
Yeah, so what this law does is it makes gender a synonym with sex, which right now it's not the case. Right now under Idaho law, the definition of sex is a very scientific definition. Right now, the current definition is the immutable biological and physiological characteristics, specifically the chromosomes, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a very scientific definition right now for the term sex. And what this law does is it replaces that definition with an individual's biological sex, either male or female. So it makes Idaho define sex as very binary.
Yeah, and and it really seems to conflate it with gender, which, you know, just from having taken sociology classes, working in the medical field, those are different things. So what are these representatives trying to accomplish, or what is their goal by changing these definitions and conflating sex and gender?
Right, yeah. So Representative Young, she said words are really important to her, and this bill, what she sees it as is a very clear and easy way for policymakers moving forward to just identify the definition of sex. And Representative Skog, a co-sponsor of the bill, said, you know, this would have been useful in crafting last year's House Bill 71, which was one of the most controversial bills passed in 2023, which criminalizes medical providers from providing gender-affirming care to transgender youth. So you see this kind of policy being on the radar of the Idaho GOP.
I just think it's really interesting also, just like a side note, is that the Alliance Defending Freedom is a religious organization. The Heritage Foundation is a political organization. These aren't medical organizations. Do you happen to know if any medical organizations were consulted when making this bill?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Representative Young or Representative Skog consulted with any medical organizations, but doctors and mental health therapists did speak against this bill in committee. So, you know, a doctor in Southeast Idaho, Dr. Jessica Rowland, she pleaded with the Senate State Affairs Committee that, you know, gender is not binary, and that this really forces a binary point of view into Idahoans. And as a doctor, that would impact her career. And the same thing with a mental health therapist. They testified like, this bill is harmful to my transgender patients.
You mentioned those testimonies. During the public testimony portion of the legislative session for this bill, did you notice, was there much support for it? Was it much opposition? What did that kind of look like? What was the feel for that?
Yeah, so I was looking back at whenever I covered this in Senate. So this bill first went through House State Affairs. During the testimony process, 15 people testified against this. Nobody testified in favor of it. And a lot of those people were transgender people, a mental health counselor, a minister, an intersex person, and representatives from advocacy groups like the ACLU of Idaho, Legal Voice, and Planned Parenthood Alliance advocates. And then in Senate State Affairs, 10 people testified against it, kind of the same group of people. And then one group testified in favor, which was a representative from the Idaho Family Policy Center, which is a conservative group that has helped spearhead a lot of Idaho legislation related to libraries. Last year, this group tried to ban public drag, and they helped craft the library bill. So this group that testified in favor, they're the ones that testified in favor, and they're more conservative leaning.
Okay, so it really sounds like to me this wasn't a popular bill with doctors, mental health professionals, and the people who would be impacted, I guess actual Idahoans, but some specific groups who maybe have religious or political leanings were really in favor of it.
Yeah.
And then this was ultimately signed into law by Governor Little. So when will that law go into effect?
Yeah, so this bill takes effect on July 1st, as do a lot of other bills that we'll be talking about today. Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts about this bill or anything else that people should know that this could have an impact moving forward, or maybe they should be prepared for how something might change or ways this might impact current laws in Idaho?
I guess one thing I do want to point out, so with the sex definition bill, the pronouns bill, with the gender affirming care and Medicaid or public fund bill, we have the same group of people testifying against, the same people I would see in committee, the same leadership opposing and voting in favor of this. So one thing that did stand out with House Bill 421, the sex definition bill, was in Senate State Affairs, there was one Republican that voted against this bill to keep it in committee, to not move it forward, and that was Senator Abby Lee. She's a Republican in Fruitland, and she said, she's sitting really heavy on her heart, hearing all the testimonies from people. And many times over again, the legislature has said that the Constitution is meant to protect the minority. And so she said, whenever we craft policy, we should think about these minorities that are coming in and testifying. And so she said, quote, "I think that should matter to us." So she was the only Republican to really oppose this verbally. But I think that's a theme that a lot of people bring up is, are we protecting the minority? And that's just something that I've kind of seen while covering these bills.
Yeah, no, and I think that is a really powerful statement to make in a state where we have a party that is a supermajority. And this idea of how do we balance the, majority rule, minority rights. I also think that is really, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think I hear from a lot of people, does it matter? Does it matter when we testify? Does it matter when we send emails? Does it matter when we call? Because sometimes it feels like they aren't listening. They've already got their mind made up. They've already talked to lobbyists. And so I think Abby Lee saying that this testimony does matter, that it was weighing on her, that it was part of her decision and part of her vote. I think that is very important for people in Idaho to hear, that for some of our lawmakers, that really does matter. And just, I do think it is an important side note, though, that Senator Abby Lee is not running for re-election. So that maybe also plays a role. Sometimes that seems to be the deciding factor in whether people speak out or not.
This episode is brought to you by ShipStation. If you run an e-commerce business, you know how much work it takes to produce something great while dealing with complicated shipping issues. That's why over 130,000 companies have turned to ShipStation, an innovative tool that allows you to focus less on shipping and more on building your brand. With ShipStation, you can manage orders, label printing, reporting, and customer service on one easy-to-use dashboard. You'll reduce warehouse costs with reliable enterprise solutions and save thousands on shipping costs with discounts up to 89% off. Plus, you can effortlessly import orders from everywhere you sell online. So, turn your shipping challenges into opportunities for growth. Go to ShipStation.com and use code POD to sign up for your free 60-day trial. That's ShipStation.com, code POD.
Okay, Mia. So that unfortunately was not the only bill that specifically targeted trans, non-binary, and intersex Idahoans that got traction this legislative session. There was also House Bill 538, or the Pronoun Bill. This was sponsored by Representative Ted Hill and Representative Chris Trakel. What was the purpose behind this pronoun bill, or can you explain this a little bit for us?
Yeah, so bill sponsors frame this as a freedom of speech bill. They say people shouldn't be forced to call people certain pronouns if they don't agree with that. So that's the purpose behind this, according to bill sponsors.
Is there anywhere that we saw where people were being compelled to call people certain names or use certain pronouns? Was there any freedom of speech issue actually happening?
Not that I know of. This bill particularly has an emphasis on schools, so I'm not sure of any instances where this was brought up to the bill sponsors, but I think they were really focusing on teachers and students.
And with the previous bill, we know that there were certain special interest groups who were involved in crafting that legislation. Do we know if there were any special interest groups involved in making this bill?
Right. So I'm not sure at the top of my head, but I know the Idaho Family Policy Center, again, they praised this bill. They testified in favor of this bill. So they certainly were a group that were supportive of this.
Did you see in your coverage of this, the Democrats in either the House or the Senate, were they making any statements about these bills or testifying against them when it came time for a vote?
The Democrats all spoke against this bill. Senator Wintrow particularly spoke against this bill. She used to teach gender studies, and so she said in committee, whenever I have students, I introduce myself using my pronouns, and I have my students do the same. And so this is an important part of just being inclusive. Mm-hmm. So that's something she brought up. And then as for groups that testified against, I know the ACLU of Idaho, they argued that this bill would allow teachers to misgender, transgender, or non-binary students, and they argued that it was discriminatory and has the potential to be unconstitutional.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting thing that, students are required by law to be in school. That's not an optional thing. And so these Idaho students who are trans, non-binary, or intersex are being legally required to be in a place where now who they are as a person or who they see themselves won't necessarily be respected, and they can feel discriminated against, and they don't have a lot of say in whether they want to be in that situation or not. Are there any other potential implications or areas where this might impact Idahoans?
I think just listening to the testimony, we hear on and on that this legislation is discriminatory to the transgender community. So as for implications, I think what we heard time and time again in testimony by the groups testifying in opposition to this legislation is that this undermines the existence of transgender people. And so that's the main implication here with this bill. And one interesting argument that Senator Trakel brought up is, if people don't like him, nobody has to call him senator. Nobody's forced to call him senator. And so he used that same logic. So it's the same way I shouldn't have to use a certain pronoun if I don't want to. And then he said, you can't legislate respect. That's a separate issue. And so what this legislation does is it protects people that, don't want to have something forced onto them. So that's kind of the logic behind this.
Oh, interesting. I mean, we could call it logic. We could call it lots of things. Personally, I think it's very interesting he would choose an elected position as something like, you don't have to call me this thing that I am temporarily holding for a small amount of time, as opposed to somebody's personal self, how they identify as a human. It's just, not exactly the same, but he was trying. Mia, there was one more bill I definitely want to hit on while I still have you here, and that was House Bill 668. And this was another Representative Young, Representative Skog special. And this bill would stop both adults and youth who are transgender, intersex, or non-binary from accessing gender-affirming care if they're on Medicaid or enrolled in state insurance. And Governor Little signed this into law late last month. So what kind of an impact is this going to have on transgender, intersex, and non-binary Idahoans?
Right, yeah, and with these bills, they don't specifically say the words transgender, but they say, public funds will not be used to alter somebody's appearance in order to affirm their perception of their gender or that's inconsistent with their sex. Whenever I think about the impact, I just think about the people that testified in committee, some of whom included transgender state employees who said, I am a state employee and I use my state insurance to get gender affirming care. So people, and they were adults, and then people, also people that have children that are enrolled in Medicaid that are transgender. They said, my daughter, she's a transgender girl, and we're enrolled in Medicaid and she seeks gender affirming care. We saw in testimony, there was a woman in Caldwell who she works at a Head Start, and she said she loves Idaho. She's hoping to buy a house soon, and she's thinking of trying to get a state job because she wants to get that state insurance for her for her gender affirming care. And her insurance is about to expire, so she was looking to get a state job, but with this law that would, basically force her to leave Idaho, which she doesn't want to do, but she needs this health care because it saved her life whenever she was struggling with mental health issues years ago.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting. Last session, we've talked about, very briefly, House Bill 71 and how that stopped gender affirming care for children. And there was a lot of emphasis on let kids grow up, let them decide for themselves. But then this session, they made it very clear that they didn't really want gender affirming care for adults either. That this wasn't just about the kids, that this was about not letting adults make that decision either.
Right. Yeah. And, the sponsors of this bill, they see this as a taxpayer responsibility bill. We don't want to make sure any Idaho taxpayers are having their money spent on something that Idaho does not support. And yeah, this definitely is not just last year. It was targeted towards parental rights. We want to make sure that parents have more of a say, and we want to make sure that children aren't having access to hormones or puberty blockers. So this bill is doing that for adults as well, like you said, that are enrolled in Medicaid or state employees.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, lots of Idahoans pay taxes. I pay taxes. Trans Idahoans pay taxes. And so I just think it's really interesting that with this law, though, there will still be gender affirming care for cis adults and children who need gender affirming care, which is something that happens often. As a nurse, as someone who worked in healthcare, that happens all the time. There are all kinds of cisgender people who need to get testosterone shots and estrogen and their Viagra. That's all gender affirming care. And as a taxpayer, we're still paying for that, just only not for trans Idahoans.
That's what Democrats said in committee, is that this bill, they believe that it's discriminatory to transgender Idahoans. And like you said, they said the same thing. They also pay taxes. So another concern that was brought up whenever this bill was going through the committee process was, is this constitutional? Is this going to lead to more lawsuits like House Bill 71? And so that was certainly on the radar of a lot of opponents.
Mia, rounding out the session, you wrote about the press conferences that both the GOP and Democratic Party leadership held to discuss the end of the session and what happened in some of these bills. And what did they say, maybe more specifically, about the bills that we've covered and how they felt how the session went?
Yeah, so the GOP held a press conference and I asked Speaker Mike Moyle, do you think these laws will be upheld in court, given that so many people had those constitutionality concerns in committee? And he said, he hopes so, and that these are laws that he believes most Idahoans agree with. And I asked Speaker Mike Moyle if he thought these laws were discriminatory, and he said no. So he called these bills just common sense bills, the pronouns bill and the sex definition bill particularly, that there's man and woman. So to him, this is And the GOP, this is just common sense legislation. As for the Democrats, they also held a press conference, and I asked, do they agree with Speaker Mike Moyle that most Idahoans want this sort of legislation? House Minority Leader Ilana Rubel, a Democrat in Boise, she said she doesn't think most Idahoans would want to be involved in potential lawsuits, given that, that does cost a lot of taxpayer money. And Senator Wintrow brought up that most people in the Senate State Affairs Committee that spoke against these bills were opposed to it. So, and there was usually just one person, one group in favor of these bills. So it was interesting to hear what both parties had to say about the sex definition bill, the pronouns bill, and the no public funds for gender affirming care bill. But all of them have really consistent opposition and consistent support from the same groups.
Well, thank you so much, Mia. I really appreciated you being here so we could delve into this. And thank you for all of the reporting you did during the session.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for paying attention to the session.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, why not subscribe to our Hey Boise newsletter to get even more local info? We'll be back tomorrow morning with everything you need to know about an Idaho case that's heading to the Supreme Court. See you then.